When you build a dock more beautiful than your HOAs, you think your neighbors will admire it. Where I live, that makes you public enemy number one. I'm Cole Walker, and I had no idea that dock would start a full-blown war. The dock my grandfather left behind looked like rotting lumber, so I rebuilt it into a work of art, complete with sunset viewing benches, underwater LED lighting, and slip-resistant walkways. 2 weeks after completion, neighbors started coming here instead of the HOA's picnic area. That's when Patricia Northwood, our HOA president, decided to fix the situation by demolishing my dock without saying a single word. But she had no idea I'd just figured out how to turn this entire lake into my personal playground. Comment below if an HOA has ever messed with you. I want to know if this drama sounds familiar. I woke up early that Saturday morning, planning to enjoy my coffee while admiring the dock I'd spent 3 months perfecting. The sunrise over Lake Millfield was always spectacular, especially from the custom bench I'd built at the end of the pier. But when I opened the cabin door and looked toward the water, my masterpiece had turned into floating debris. Chunks of treated lumber bobbed on the surface like pieces of a shattered dream. The underwater lights I'd installed were dark, their wiring severed and dangling into the murky depths. The whole structure, every carefully measured board, every perfectly placed nail, had been reduced to expensive firewood drifting aimlessly across the cove. Standing on the shore with a triumphant smile was Patricia Northwood, clutching a piece of paper she called her emergency order. Next to her stood Bruce Tate, our HOA treasurer, nodding like a bobblehead doll. 2 workers were still operating chainsaws, cutting through the last remaining support posts with mechanical efficiency. Sawdust filled the air, and the sound of power tools echoed across the lake like some industrial nightmare. I stood there in my pajamas, watching 3 months of careful craftsmanship being reduced to floating garbage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd designed this dock to bring beauty to our community, and now it looked like a hurricane had hit. The neighbors were already gathering, drawn by the noise and destruction. Mrs. Dorothy Wilson, who lived 3 houses down, was shaking her head in dismay. The Hendersons from across the cove had walked over to see what was happening. Even the Kramers, who rarely left their house, were standing on their porch with coffee mugs, watching the spectacle unfold. Patricia seemed to be enjoying the attention, gesturing dramatically at the debris while explaining to anyone who would listen about safety violations and unauthorized construction. She was wearing her usual outfit, wrinkled jeans and an oversized sweater that had seen better days, but carrying herself like she was delivering a State of the Union address. This dock violated safety regulations and was built without proper authorization, Patricia announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. She held up her piece of paper like it was some kind of legal document, though I could tell from here it was just a standard sheet of printer paper with her own handwriting on it. As HOA president, I have the authority to remove any structure that poses a danger to our community. Bruce nodded enthusiastically beside her, though I suspected he had no more legal knowledge than a golden retriever. The workers continued their demolition, seemingly oblivious to the crowd that had gathered, or the fact that they were destroying someone's private property. I walked down to the water's edge, still trying to process what I was seeing. "Patricia, do you have a demolition permit for this?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible despite the rage building in my chest. She laughed and waved her piece of paper in my direction. "I don't need a permit when something is a clear and present danger," she declared, as if she was quoting some law she'd memorized. "This dock was built without HOA approval and violates multiple safety codes." The irony was overwhelming. This was the same woman who'd installed a hot tub on her deck without asking anyone's permission, yet somehow my professionally designed dock was the problem. "Show me the safety codes it violates," I said, pulling out my phone. I'd documented every step of the construction process, from the engineering specifications to the county permits I'd obtained. Patricia's confident expression faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "The codes are in the HOA handbook, which you clearly never bothered to read," she snapped. "This structure was creating noise disturbances and encouraging unauthorized gathering. Translation, people were actually enjoying themselves at my dock instead of attending her poorly planned HOA events." The workers finished their destruction and began loading their equipment back into their truck, leaving behind nothing but floating debris and Patricia's smug satisfaction. "I'm calling the police," I announced, reaching for my phone's dial pad. Patricia's laugh grew even louder, and she turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors. "Go ahead and call them. They'll thank me for preventing a potential accident. This dock was a lawsuit waiting to happen, and I've just saved our entire community from legal liability." Her confidence was almost impressive, if it weren't so completely unfounded. As I watched the last pieces of my grandfather's legacy floating away like driftwood, I realized this wasn't just about a dock anymore. This was war. The first thing I did was call Tom Bradley. Tom had been my neighbor since we were kids, back when this area was just scattered cabins and fishing spots. Now he was one of the county's most respected attorneys, specializing in property law. If anyone could tell me where Patricia had overstepped her bounds, it would be Tom. He answered on the second ring, probably wondering why I was calling him at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning. "Cole? What's going on, buddy?" His familiar voice came through the speaker. "Patricia Northwood just demolished my dock with chainsaws," I said, still watching the debris float across the lake. "She claims she had the legal authority to do it." There was a long pause before Tom spoke again. "She what?" Tom arrived at my cabin within 20 minutes, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression he usually reserved for courtrooms. He surveyed the destruction with the eye of someone who'd seen his share of property disputes, taking photos with his phone and making notes on a legal pad. "Cole, what Patricia did isn't just wrong, it's criminal," he said after examining her so-called emergency order. "She can't demolish private property without at least 30 days written notice, and even then, only after due process. This piece of paper she wrote up has no legal standing whatsoever." He pointed to the floating debris. "This is destruction of private property, plain and simple. She's looking at both civil and criminal liability." The validation felt good, but I needed to understand the bigger picture. How did she think she could get away with this? I asked, genuinely puzzled by Patricia's boldness. Tom shook his head. "Power corrupts, even in small doses. Some people get elected to HOA positions and think they're running their own little kingdom. They forget that homeowners have actual rights that can't be trampled by neighborhood politics." He showed me the relevant state statutes on his phone, explaining how HOA authority was limited by law. "The bottom line is, she stepped way over the line, and now she's going to face the consequences." While Tom was documenting the damage, I decided to gather some intelligence about Patricia's recent behavior. Mrs. Dorothy Wilson had lived in this community longer than anyone else, and she had a memory like a steel trap when it came to neighborhood drama. I found her tending to her flower garden, still shaking her head about the morning's events. "That woman has been out of control lately," she told me, wiping soil from her hands with a gardening glove. "Last week she came to my house with a measuring tape, claiming my grass was too long. Too long! I've been maintaining this lawn since before she was born, and suddenly I'm violating some imaginary standard?" Mrs. Wilson's story was just the beginning. As word spread about what had happened to my dock, other neighbors started sharing their own Patricia horror stories. The Hendersons had been fined for having a mailbox that was allegedly the wrong shade of black. The Morrison family received a violation notice for putting up Christmas lights 3 days before the approved date. Sarah Chen, who lived at the end of our street, had been threatened with legal action for planting flowers that weren't on the HOA's approved species list. It was becoming clear that Patricia's attack on my dock wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of harassment and control. The most telling detail emerged during my conversation with Mrs. Wilson. "Ever since your dock was finished, people have been gathering there in the evenings instead of going to Patricia's events," she explained. "You know how she organizes those monthly community meetings at the HOA pavilion? Well, attendance has dropped to almost nothing because everyone prefers to watch the sunset from your dock." That was the key. My dock hadn't just violated Patricia's sense of authority, it had made her irrelevant. She'd built her identity around being the center of our little community, and my dock had inadvertently stolen her thunder. Just as Mrs. Wilson finished explaining the situation, Patricia herself appeared around the corner, marching toward us with the determination of a woman on a mission. "There's too much noise over here," she announced before she'd even reached us. "This constitutes a violation of our community's noise ordinances." I looked around at our perfectly quiet conversation and had to suppress a laugh. Mrs. Wilson wasn't having any of it. "Patricia, we're standing in my garden, having a normal conversation. If that's too noisy for you, perhaps you should consider moving to a monastery." Patricia's face reddened, but she pressed on with her manufactured outrage. "Furthermore," Patricia continued, ignoring Mrs. Wilson's sarcasm, "I'm implementing new rules regarding waterfront additions. From now on, all structures near the lake must receive pre-approval from the HOA board. She said this with the authority of someone announcing federal legislation, apparently forgetting that my dock had been built on my own property with proper county permits. Tom Bradley, who had been quietly observing this exchange, stepped forward with his lawyer smile. "Patricia, you might want to consult with legal counsel before making announcements like that. What you did this morning could result in both civil and criminal charges." For the first time since the demolition began, Patricia's confidence seemed to waver. But I wasn't waiting for legal proceedings to make my point. While Patricia was still processing Tom's warning, I excused myself and walked to my workshop behind the cabin. 20 minutes later, I emerged with a beautifully crafted wooden sign that read, "Walker Family Dock, since 1987, in elegant carved letters. I carried it down to the water's edge and planted it firmly in the mud where my dock had stood just hours earlier. The message was clear. This was my family's land, my family's legacy, and no amount of HOA theatrics was going to erase that history. As I walked back up the slope, Mrs. Wilson caught my eye and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "She's been meeting with some strange men lately. I think she's planning something bigger than just your dock." By afternoon, word of the dock demolition had spread through our community like wildfire. I decided to turn Patricia's aggression into an opportunity by organizing what I called an impromptu community meeting right at the site of my destroyed dock. If Patricia wanted to make this a public spectacle, I'd give her one. I sent a few text messages to neighbors I was friendly with, and they spread the word to others. Within an hour, my waterfront property had transformed into something resembling a small festival. People brought folding chairs, coolers full of drinks and snacks to share. What started as a gathering to discuss HOA overreach became an impromptu block party that was exactly the kind of community spirit I'd hoped to foster when I built the dock in the first place. The turnout was incredible. More than 30 families showed up, including some I barely knew from the far end of our neighborhood. Everyone wanted to hear the story of the dock demolition firsthand, and many had their own Patricia horror stories to share. Lisa Martinez told us about being fined for putting up Christmas lights one day before the approved date. Mike Thompson had received a violation notice for having a mailbox that was supposedly the wrong shade of black. The Chen family had been threatened with legal action for planting roses that weren't on some mysterious approved species list. But just as the sharing session was gaining momentum, Bob Henderson from the corner house stood up, with obvious discomfort written across his face. "Look, Cole, I feel bad about your dock," Bob said nervously, glancing around at the crowd. "But some of us are worried about making Patricia angrier than she already is. My wife and I just got our house refinanced, and we can't afford to get hit with a bunch of HOA fines right now." An uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering as other neighbors exchanged worried glances. "Patricia already threatened to review everyone's property records for violations," Bob continued. "Maybe we should try to work with her instead of, making this into a war." I could see doubt creeping into some faces around the group. Patricia's intimidation tactics were working exactly as she'd intended. Before I could respond to Bob's concerns, my phone buzzed with a notification that made my blood run cold. Someone had sent me a link to a video posted on a local community forum, showing Patricia standing in front of the demolished dock wreckage with the caption, "Removing safety hazards from our community." In the video, she was claiming that my dock had been built with substandard materials and posed a drowning risk to children. "This is exactly why we have HOA oversight," she said directly to the camera. "Some residents think they can build whatever they want without considering the safety of their neighbors." The lies were so blatant and the propaganda so shameless that I felt my hands shaking with rage. I almost turned off my phone and canceled the whole gathering right there. The video was already getting shares and supportive comments from people who didn't know the real story, and I could see how quickly Patricia's narrative could become the accepted truth. For a moment, I seriously considered just paying whatever fines she wanted and trying to rebuild my dock quietly somewhere else. But then I looked around at my neighbors. Real people who had taken time out of their Saturday to show support for what was right, and realized that backing down now would just encourage Patricia to escalate her harassment of everyone else. "You know what?" I said, pulling out my phone and opening the live stream function. "I think it's time people heard the truth about what's really happening in our community." I held up the phone so everyone could see that I was broadcasting live, then turned to address both the camera and the crowd around me. "Hi everyone, I'm Cole Walker, and I want you to see what happens when you try to improve your community and an HOA president decides you're a threat to her authority." I panned the camera across the floating debris where my dock used to be, then toward the supportive neighbors who had gathered despite Patricia's intimidation tactics. As if summoned by some malevolent force, Patricia and Bruce appeared at the edge of my property like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Patricia was carrying her ever-present clipboard and had her phone out, presumably recording evidence of our heinous crime of having a conversation on private property. "This gathering is in violation of our community noise ordinances," she announced, marching toward us with Bruce trailing behind like a nervous sidekick. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately or face fines for participating in an unauthorized gathering." The irony was breathtaking. Here we were, sitting quietly on private property, and somehow this constituted a violation worthy of financial penalties. But Bruce had apparently decided to escalate beyond Patricia's usual threats. As people started to pack up their chairs, he approached the Henderson family with a manila folder and a predatory smile. "Bob, I've been reviewing your property records," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It looks like that shed you built last year might not have proper setback clearances. I'd hate to have to order a professional survey, but if you continue participating in activities like this, well, the HOA board might have to take a closer look at everyone's compliance status." The threat was clear and calculated. Support Cole, and we'll find expensive ways to make your life miserable. That was the moment everything changed. Mrs. Wilson, who had been quietly observing the confrontation, stood up from her folding chair and fixed Bruce with a stare that could have melted steel. "Honey, I've been living in this community since before you were born, and I've seen plenty of bullies come and go, but I've never seen anyone quite as pathetic as someone who threatens families for having a picnic." She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of good citizenship. "If Patricia and Bruce want to turn our neighborhood into their personal police state, that's their choice, but they're going to have to go through every one of us to do it." The transformation was immediate and inspiring. Instead of packing up to leave, neighbors started setting up more chairs and unpacking more food. Children who had been playing quietly began laughing and running around again. Bob Henderson, who had been so worried about fines just minutes earlier, walked directly over to Bruce and said, "You know what? Go ahead and order that survey. I'll pay for it myself just to prove there's nothing wrong with my shed." Patricia's face was cycling through several shades of red as she realized that her intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly. "Fine," she finally shouted, loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "You want to play games? I'll show you who really has authority around here. This whole lake area is about to change, and there's nothing any of you can do to stop it." The next morning, I decided to do some detective work. Patricia's threat about major changes to the lake area had been bothering me all night, especially combined with Mrs. Wilson's observation about mysterious meetings. I convinced Tom to help me with what we jokingly called reconnaissance, though it quickly became clear this was no laughing matter. We followed Patricia's car when she left her house around 10 o'clock, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while staying close enough to see where she was headed. She drove to a restaurant called Denny's, about 15 minutes away, not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find real estate conspiracies, but perfect for clandestine meetings. Through the restaurant window, we watched Patricia meet with a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. This wasn't some casual breakfast meeting between friends. The body language was all business, with documents being spread across the table and Sirius pointing at what appeared to be maps or charts. Tom and I managed to get a table close enough to overhear parts of their conversation without being obvious about our eavesdropping. What we heard made my blood run cold. The man was representing something called Lakeside Development LLC, and they were discussing a deal to lease all waterfront rights from our HOA. The conversation revealed Patricia's true motivation for attacking my dock and harassing other homeowners. Lakeside Development wanted to create what they called premium lake access by removing all private docks and replacing them with a single professionally managed waterfront facility. Homeowners would pay monthly fees for boat storage and lake access, while the development company would pocket the profits and pay Patricia a management fee of $2,000 per month. It was a scheme to monetize our lake access, while giving Patricia both money and increased power over the community. "The private docks are the main obstacle," the suit explained to Patricia over coffee and pancakes. "Once those are gone, we can implement the unified waterfront plan and start generating revenue immediately. Your demolition of that designer's dock was perfect timing. It sends a clear message about who's in control." Patricia preened under the praise, clearly enjoying her role as the enforcer in this scheme. "I've already started issuing violation notices to other waterfront property owners," she said proudly. "Give me another month and I'll have them all ready to surrender their dock rights voluntarily." Tom and I exchanged glances that could have melted steel. This wasn't just about Patricia's power trip. It was about a development company using her as a front to essentially steal our lake access and turn it into a profit center. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity. They were planning to eliminate decades of traditional lake usage and replace it with a corporate-controlled system that would charge us for privileges we'd always enjoyed for free. And Patricia was getting paid handsomely to make it happen, which explained her sudden escalation in harassment tactics. We stayed long enough to hear the timeline for their plan. Patricia had promised to clear all private docks within 2 months using a combination of harassment, fake violations, and outright demolition when necessary. In return, Lakeside Development would handle all the legal paperwork and construction of the new facility, while Patricia would serve as the community liaison and collect her monthly management fee. It was a win-win situation for everyone, except the actual homeowners, who would lose their traditional lake rights and pay for the privilege of using their own neighborhood amenities. After Patricia and her co-conspirator left the restaurant, Tom and I sat in stunned silence, processing what we'd learned. "This is fraud on multiple levels," Tom said finally. "Patricia doesn't have the authority to lease community waterfront rights, and she certainly can't demolish private property to make it happen. But by the time this gets tied up in court, they might have already implemented enough of their plan to make reversal complicated." I was thinking along different lines. Legal action would take months or years, and meanwhile Patricia would continue terrorizing our neighbors into submission. I needed a solution that was immediate, decisive, and completely legal. That's when inspiration struck. "Tom, what if we could control the lake itself?" I asked. "If Lakeside Development wants to monetize lake access, what happens if there's no lake to access?" He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I was already pulling up information on my phone about Lake Millfield's water source. This entire lake is fed by Millfield Dam, which was built in 1965 by the old mill company. If that company went out of business, Tom caught on immediately. "You want to buy the dam," he said with growing excitement. "If you control the water flow, you control everything downstream." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Patricia could demolish every dock on the lake, but it wouldn't matter if there was no water to dock in. And if I owned the dam, every decision about water levels would go through me instead of some distant corporate entity. It was the ultimate reversal. Instead of fighting Patricia's scheme with legal challenges that might take years, I could simply eliminate the resource she was trying to monopolize. As we drove home, I was already making mental calculations about how much it would cost to buy water rights and whether I could afford to outbid a development company. One way or another, Patricia's scheme was about to hit a very large, very immovable obstacle. That evening, I dove deep into research about Lake Millfield's water source, driven by a combination of determination and desperation that I'd never felt before. What I'd discovered was even better than I'd hoped, but also more urgent than I'd realized. The lake was entirely dependent on Millfield Dam, which had been built in 1965 by the Millfield Mill Company to provide water for their lumber processing operations. According to county records, Millfield Mill Company had filed for bankruptcy just 6 months ago, and all their assets were being liquidated through public auction. The dam's operating rights were scheduled for auction this coming Saturday, just 5 days away. The timing felt like destiny, but my excitement was tempered by a disturbing discovery buried in the auction documentation. According to the bidder registration list, something called Lakeside Development LLC had already submitted preliminary paperwork to participate in the auction. My heart sank as I realized that Patricia's co-conspirators had apparently figured out the same strategy I had. If Lakeside Development acquired control of the dam, they wouldn't just control lake access, they'd control the lake itself. They could manipulate water levels to force out any remaining resistance to their waterfront development scheme. I called Tom Bradley immediately, even though it was nearly midnight. "Tom, we have a problem," I said when he answered groggily. "Lakeside Development is planning to bid on the dam at Saturday's auction. If they get control of the water rights, Patricia's scheme becomes unstoppable." There was a long pause while Tom processed this information. "How much money do you think they're willing to spend?" he asked. "More than I have, that's for sure," I replied. "The minimum bid is $120,000, but if they really want it, they could probably go much higher." Tuesday morning brought another nasty surprise in the form of an email that had been forwarded to me by Mrs. Wilson. Someone, probably Bruce, based on the writing style, had sent a message to several neighbors warning them about the financial risks of supporting my reckless legal challenges against the HOA. The email suggested that anyone who contributed money to my cause could be held personally liable if my actions resulted in lawsuits or property damage. It was complete nonsense legally, but psychologically effective. Several neighbors who had promised financial support called to apologetically withdraw their offers. By Wednesday afternoon, I was facing a harsh reality check about my financial situation. Even with help from family and the neighbors who were still willing to contribute, I could only raise about $140,000. That might be enough to outbid casual investors, but probably wouldn't be sufficient if Lakeside Development was serious about acquiring the dam. I spent Wednesday evenings staring at my laptop screen, trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between what I had and what I might need. The answer, when it came to me, was both obvious and terrifying. I could refinance my cabin. The property had been in my family for 3 generations and was probably worth close to $200,000. If I put it up as collateral for a loan, I could potentially raise enough money to compete with Lakeside Development. But the risk was enormous. If something went wrong with my plan, I could lose the family property that had started this whole conflict. It felt like betting everything on a single hand of poker, except the stakes were my grandfather's legacy and my own financial future. Thursday morning, I called my mortgage broker to discuss refinancing options. The conversation was sobering. "Cole, you're talking about borrowing against almost the entire value of the property," she explained. "If you can't make the payments, you'll lose the cabin. Are you sure you want to take that kind of risk?" I wasn't sure at all, but I was more sure that I couldn't let Patricia and her corporate partners steal our community's lake access. "Set up the paperwork," I told her. "I'll sign whatever documents you need." That afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from my college roommate, Dave Chen, who had driven up from the city after hearing about my situation through mutual friends. "Cole, I need to talk to you about this dam thing," he said as soon as I opened the door. "People are saying you're planning to mortgage your grandfather's cabin to get into a bidding war with developers. That's insane, man. You could lose everything." Dave had always been the practical one in our friendship, and seeing the concern in his eyes made me question whether I was making the right decision. "Dave, this isn't just about my dock anymore," I explained as we sat on the cabin's front porch looking out at the lake. "Patricia is trying to turn our entire waterfront into a corporate profit center. If I don't stop her, every family here is going to lose their traditional lake access and pay monthly fees for the privilege of using their own neighborhood amenities." Dave shook his head slowly. "But risking your home? Your grandfather's legacy? There has to be another way to fight this." His words hit harder than I wanted to admit, because deep down I knew he was right about the risks I was taking. But sometimes you reach a point where backing down feels worse than the possibility of losing everything. "Dave, my grandfather built this cabin as a place where families could enjoy the lake together. If I let Patricia destroy that vision just to play it safe, then I've already lost what matters most." I pulled out my phone and showed him the video Patricia had posted, with her lies about safety hazards and substandard construction. "She's not going to stop with my dock. She's going to keep terrorizing families until someone with more power than she has makes her stop. Right now, that someone has to be me." Friday afternoon, I signed the refinancing paperwork that put my cabin at risk, but gave me access to enough cash to bid competitively at Saturday's auction. Walking out of the bank, I felt simultaneously empowered and terrified. I'd just mortgaged my entire future on the belief that controlling the water supply would give me enough leverage to stop Patricia's scheme, that if I was wrong, if the law didn't work the way Tom thought it would, or if I couldn't afford the ongoing costs of dam maintenance, I could lose everything my family had built over 3 generations. But as I drove home past the floating debris of my demolished dock, I knew I'd made the only choice I could live with. Saturday's auction would determine whether David could still beat Goliath in modern America. The courthouse auction room was more crowded than I'd expected, with about 40 people scattered across folding chairs that looked like they'd been borrowed from a church basement. Most of the attendees appeared to be serious investors or representatives from development companies, dressed in expensive suits and carrying thick folders of documentation. I felt slightly out of place in my business casual outfit, but reminded myself that I had just as much right to be there as anyone else. The auctioneer was a thin man with a surprisingly loud voice, who began the proceedings by explaining the terms and conditions for all the Millfield Mill Company assets being sold. The dam operating rights were item number 7 on a list that included everything from industrial equipment to timber rights on thousands of acres. I tried to appear casual while mentally rehearsing my bidding strategy, but my heart was racing as we worked through the earlier items. A logging company bought the timber rights for $300,000. Various pieces of mill equipment went to scrap dealers and antique collectors. Finally, the auctioneer called for bids on the Millfield Dam water flow control rights, and I felt like everyone in the room could hear my pulse pounding. "We'll start the bidding at $120,000, the auctioneer announced. I waited for someone else to make the opening bid, not wanting to seem too eager. A man in a gray suit near the front raised his paddle, and the auctioneer acknowledged him with a nod. $120,000 from bidder 14. I raised my own paddle. $130,000 from bidder 22. The bidding continued in $10,000 increments, with Gray Suit and myself trading increases back and forth, while the rest of the room watched with apparent disinterest. At $160,000, Gray Suit hesitated before making his next bid. I could see him checking notes in his folder, possibly calculating whether the water rights were worth more than his authorized spending limit. When he bid $170,000, I immediately countered with $180,000. The pause that followed felt like an eternity. But finally, Gray Suit shook his head and lowered his paddle. "Do I hear $190,000? The auctioneer called out, scanning the room for any other bidders. Silence. Going once, going twice, the gavel came down with a bang that seemed to echo through my entire body. I'd won. For $180,000, I now owned the operating rights to Millfield Dam and complete control over the water flow to Lake Millfield. The financial impact was staggering. I'd essentially mortgaged my entire future on this one purchase. But the strategic implications were even more significant. Patricia could demolish every dock on the lake, harass every homeowner in our community, and sign whatever deal she wanted with lakeside development. None of it would matter if there was no water in the lake to begin with. The paperwork took another hour to complete, but by noon I was walking out of the courthouse with legal documents proving that I controlled the water supply for our entire community. I drove home in a state of excited anticipation, knowing that Patricia's final demolition threat was scheduled for Monday morning. She had no idea that the balance of power had just shifted completely in my favor. I spent the rest of Saturday making arrangements with the dam's current operator, a gruff but friendly man named Earl who'd been managing the facility for the mill company for over 20 years. "Most of the time, the dam pretty much runs itself," he explained during our phone conversation. "But when you want to adjust the flow rate, just give me a call and I can make whatever changes you need." I asked him about the timeline for water level changes, and his answer was perfect for my purposes. Depending on how much you want to drop it, you can see significant changes in the lake level within a few hours. Sunday passed quietly, with no sign of Patricia or any preparation for her threatened demolition. I spent the day working on my temporary floating dock, which was coming together beautifully, using recycled materials and plastic barrels for flotation. Several neighbors stopped by to help with construction and ask about my plans for dealing with Patricia's latest threats. I deflected their questions with vague assurances that everything would work out fine, not wanting to reveal my ace in the hole until the perfect moment arrived. That evening, I called Earl to discuss the logistics of what I was planning. "I need to reduce the lake level by about 40% tomorrow morning," I told him. "How quickly can that happen?" Earl's chuckle suggested he'd received stranger requests during his career. "No problem. Just give me a call when you want to start, and I'll begin reducing the outflow gradually. Should take about 2 to 3 hours to see the full effect, depending on weather conditions." Everything was falling into place perfectly. Patricia thought she was about to deliver her final blow against community resistance. Instead, she was about to learn that there are bigger fish in every pond. Monday morning arrived with crystal clear skies and what felt like poetic justice brewing in the air. I woke up early and positioned myself at my front window with a cup of coffee, waiting for Patricia's demolition crew to arrive. At exactly 8 o'clock, I heard the rumble of heavy machinery coming down our street. Patricia had upgraded from chainsaws to serious equipment. 2 bulldozers and what appeared to be a small crane. She was clearly planning to make a statement that would intimidate any remaining resistance in our community. What she didn't know was that I was about to make a much bigger statement that would end her reign of terror permanently. Patricia arrived at my property like a conquering general, complete with heavy machinery and what appeared to be a small media entourage. She'd invited the local newspaper and even a freelance videographer, apparently planning to document her final victory over community resistance. The bulldozers rumbled into position while Patricia stood nearby with her clipboard, directing the operation like she was commanding a military assault. Bruce Tate hovered behind her, nervously checking his watch and occasionally glancing toward the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to witness this latest escalation in our HOA drama. The entire neighborhood seemed to have turned out for the spectacle. Families stood on their porches and in their yards, many holding phones to record what promised to be either Patricia's ultimate triumph or a complete disaster. Mrs. Wilson had brought a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, settling in like she was attending an outdoor theater performance. The Morrison family had positioned themselves strategically on their deck to get the best view, while the Hendersons were live streaming everything from their front yard. Patricia seemed to be feeding off the attention, gesturing dramatically and speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear her justifications for the demolition. "Today we're removing the last unauthorized structures from our waterfront area," Patricia announced to her impromptu audience. "This will ensure the safety and beauty of our community lake access for all residents." She was wearing what appeared to be her best outfit, a blazer that had seen better days but was clearly her attempt at looking official and authoritative. The bulldozer operator looked bored, probably wondering why such a simple demolition job required so much pageantry. But Patricia was savoring every moment of what she believed would be her complete victory over my resistance to her authority. I walked down to the water's edge carrying a manila envelope, moving slowly and deliberately to maximize the dramatic effect. Patricia noticed my approach and actually smiled, probably thinking I was about to surrender or plead for mercy. "Patricia," I called out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "before you demolish anything else, you might want to take a look at this." I handed her the envelope with the same ceremonial gravity she'd used when distributing her fake violation notices. "What is this?" she demanded, though her confident tone was already beginning to waver slightly. Patricia opened the envelope and pulled out the official certificate of ownership for Millfield Dam water rights. For a moment, she stared at the document with obvious confusion, probably trying to process legal language she didn't understand. "What does this have to do with anything?" she asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "That's my proof of ownership for the dam that controls all the water in this lake," I explained calmly. "As of Saturday, I own the complete water flow rights to Lake Millfield, which means I can turn off the water to this entire lake whenever I choose." The crowd fell silent as the implications of my announcement sank in. Patricia's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally something approaching panic. "You can't do that," she spluttered. That's illegal. You can't just turn off a lake." I pulled out my phone and called Earl, putting the conversation on speaker so everyone could hear. "Earl, this is Cole Walker. I need you to reduce the outflow by 50% starting right now." Earl's cheerful voice came through the phone clearly. "You got it, Cole. Starting the reduction process now. Should see the water level dropping within about 20 minutes. Patricia's demolition crew looked confused as their boss began pacing frantically and making increasingly desperate phone calls. The neighborhood audience was completely captivated, watching this real-time demonstration of power that none of them had seen coming. Within 30 minutes, the water level had dropped enough to expose several feet of lake bottom around the shoreline. Boat docks throughout the community became useless as their boats sat stranded on mud and exposed rocks. Most importantly, the expensive boats belonging to Patricia and her co-conspirators were now sitting high and dry, looking ridiculous and completely inaccessible. "This is insane!" Patricia screamed, apparently forgetting about her media audience as panic completely overtook her earlier confidence. "You can't just drain a lake because you're mad about your dock." I maintained my calm demeanor, speaking clearly so everyone could hear my response. "Actually, I can. I own the water rights, which means I have complete legal authority over the water level. Just like you claimed to have authority over my dock." The parallel was perfect. Patricia had used claimed authority to destroy my property, and now I was using actual authority to demonstrate the consequences of her actions. The coup de grace came when Patricia tried to call her contact at Lakeside Development for help. I could hear the man's angry voice through her phone as he realized that their entire scheme had just collapsed. "How could you not know about the water rights?" he was shouting. "Our whole plan was based on controlling lake access. There's no point in leasing waterfront rights if Patricia's deal was falling apart in real time, broadcasted live to the entire neighborhood and being recorded by multiple phones for posterity." "Please," Patricia finally said, her voice cracking with desperation, "just turn the water back on. I'll resign from the HOA, I'll cancel all the violation notices. Just please don't destroy the lake." The transformation was complete, from arrogant dictator to pleading supplicant in less than 2 hours. I looked around at my neighbors, many of whom were smiling for the first time in months. "Earl," I said into my phone, Restore normal water flow, please. As Patricia slumped against one of her useless bulldozers in defeat, I realized that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to acquire more power than they have and demonstrate your willingness to use it. 6 months later, our community had returned to the peaceful coexistence we'd enjoyed before Patricia's reign of terror. The new HOA board, elected after Patricia and Bruce's resignation, focused on actual community improvement rather than power thrips and fake violation notices. I used some of my remaining savings to build a new community dock, bigger and more beautiful than my original, with a sign reading, "Residence Dock, no HOA approval required." The dock became exactly what I had originally envisioned, a gathering place where neighbors could meet, children could fish safely, and everyone could enjoy the sunset over Lake Millfield without worrying about arbitrary fines or harassment. Mrs. Wilson hosted a celebration barbecue at the new dock, with the entire neighborhood contributing food and drinks. As we watched the sun set over the lake, she raised her glass of lemonade in a toast. "To Cole Walker," she announced, "who taught us that the best way to deal with a bully is to control something they need more than they control something you want." The laughter and applause felt better than any legal victory could have. Patricia had learned that community spirit and creative problem-solving will always triumph over petty tyranny and manufactured authority. As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home, I stood alone on the dock I'd built for all of us to enjoy. The water lapped gently against the pilings, and the underwater lights created a magical glow beneath the surface. My grandfather would have been proud of what this place had become. Not just a beautiful structure, but a symbol of what communities can accomplish when they work together instead of allowing themselves to be divided by people who mistake authority for leadership. I'm not a fighter by nature, but if you sink my memories, I'll drain your whole world. And sometimes that's exactly what bullies need to understand the difference between power and authority.
QA Stories thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust us, you'll be hooked.